A young boy named Van amazes everyone in his village as he magically creates a huge, beautiful mansion. The villagers are shocked and surprised because Van seems to be able to build a house in just a second. Van decides to stay in the village and use his powers to help make it richer and better for everyone. Before this, he lives a very different life. After graduating from high school in his hometown, he leaves for the big city, excited to experience it. But city life turns out to be tough. For 10 years, he worked hard at a tiring job, coming home exhausted every night. Over time, he starts missing his peaceful, beautiful hometown more and more. One day, after an especially long day, he falls asleep. And when he wakes up, he finds himself in the body of a young boy named Van in a completely different world. Van feels shocked and confused. Looking out the window, he tries to understand where he is. Just then, his maid, Till, rushes over and tells him to stay back from the window, saying it is dangerous. Van doesn't recognize Till, as he isn't the original Van, and his way of speaking sounds too grown up for a 2-year-old boy. This surprises Till even more, leaving her unsure of what is happening. The young man, now Van, can't stop thinking about how strange it is to be nearly 30 years old and suddenly reincarnated as a 2-year-old duke's son. Soon, memories of the previous Van come flooding in, helping him remember the names of his family members. Till, his maid, is surprised that such a young child knows everyone's names so well. At dinner, the Duke family gathers, led by the head, Duke Jalpa. Jalpa has 4 sons, with Van as the youngest, being fed by the maids. Van finds the treatment amusing, comparing it to the VIP service at a hostess bar back in his old life. Despite everything feeling new and strange, he realizes that he still has all his memories from his past life in Japan. During dinner, Yard, the second son, occasionally glances at Van with an irritated look as Van enjoys his meal. After a while, Duke Jalpa asks Yard about his day. Yard quickly responds, explaining that he learned about fire magic and battle formations. Jalpa then turns to his third son, Sesto, who eagerly shares his own daily activities. Van listens with curiosity, noticing that Jalpa asks each of his sons about their day after dinner. He wonders if this is a custom among nobles. Then Jalpa asks Van about his day, catching him off guard as he isn't used to being asked. After a moment of surprise, Van replies that since he doesn't know much, he's decided to start by learning the history and culture of their country. Jalpa and the other sons are shocked by Van's mature response. Jalpa bursts into laughter, realizing that Van is smarter than he had thought. Since Van is his youngest son, Jalpa had assumed his late wife had spoiled him. Jalpa feels certain that Van has a strong aptitude for fire magic, just like him and his late wife, Mura. He looks forward to Van's coming-of-age ceremony, which will happen when he turns 8. At that time, they'll see if Van has a talent for magic, a test Jalpa is confident his son will pass. In this world filled with magic, it's crucial for each person to know their natural magic type and what suits them best. Nobles, in particular, face 2 main expectations. First, they should ideally possess one of the basic 4 elemental magics: water, fire, air, or earth. Second, having healing magic is highly valued. However, those with talents outside these areas often face humiliation, as these abilities are less respected. Van's family, the Fergio family, is a noble house known for its strong military skills within a large military-focused country. They take great pride in their mastery of fire magic, which is powerful in combat. Like his father and brothers, who are compatible with all 4 elements, Van's father hopes he will also show strength in the family's favored fire magic. Van reflects on how important magic is here, given the civilization's development level. Through his new memories, he learns more about his location, the Scuderia Kingdom, a powerful nation in the southern part of the Grant Continent, located in the west. In the Scuderia Kingdom, the royal family has ruled for 300 years, slowly expanding the kingdom's territory. The current king is known for his aggressive strategy, leading nobles with military power to conquer smaller countries and claim their lands. Van realizes this is likely how his father, Jalpa, earned his promotion from count to duke. As Van studies the world map, he asks Sil questions about the kingdom. She explains the country's history, the presence of monsters, and the existence of races other than humans. Till and the other maids are impressed by Van's curiosity and intelligence as he eagerly absorbs knowledge and speaks with an eloquence unusual for a child his age. They begin to see him as a young prodigy, surprised by his maturity and complex questions. The family butler, Esparta, also notices Van's advanced curiosity. Curious himself, Esparta asks Van what he has learned so far, considering that most children his age are just beginning with basic letters and numbers. Realizing he shouldn't reveal too much, Van says he hasn't learned to write yet but can understand basic ideas. To test him, Esparta asks some math questions, which Van answers correctly, impressing him even more. Esparta decides to begin teaching Van twice a week. For Van, these lessons feel like intense training, not quite what he'd expect for a normal 2-year-old. Still, he pushes through and over time learns to read, write, and understand many subjects. Over the next 2 years, Van masters various skills, including swordsmanship, which Till begins teaching him. By the time he turns 5, he is already able to spar evenly with older apprentices, known as young warriors, who are twice his age. With his past life's martial arts experience and maturity, Van easily outmatches the older young warriors. Other servants also notice that Van is different from his brothers. Unlike them, Van treats the lowercase servants kindly, often surprising them with his respectful attitude. One day, Dee, the deputy of the knights and one of the strongest in the Duke's residence, comes to meet Van. Examining Van's hands, Dee is surprised by how soft they are, as if Van doesn't practice swordsmanship. Van explains that he spends most of his time studying and only practices sword fighting when he has free time. Dee then mentions he's heard rumors that Esparta plans to increase Van's study sessions to 3 times a week. Concerned that Van might miss out on physical training, Dee encourages him to keep up with swordsmanship, even offering to train him personally and promising to help him become the top swordsman in the kingdom. Van eventually decides to balance both academics and swordsmanship. Dee promises to go easy on him since he's still a child, but this turns out to be far from the truth. Training with Dee is intense, pushing Van to his limits. Even when he's exhausted and wants to rest, Dee orders him to keep going with exercises like squats. Van comes to see Dee as less of a devil and more of a relentless, stubborn trainer. Till often checks on Van, praising his dedication and hard work. Despite the tough training, Van finds joy in this new life, feeling a sense of satisfaction he never had before. Every day feels fulfilling, and he begins to feel proud as a noble in the Furcio family. But 3 years later, his peaceful second life is suddenly about to change forever. Van is 6 years old now. Till takes him outside the estate to see the world beyond his home. He is fascinated by the bustling streets and the crowd. His eyes light up with excitement as he watches the people around him, and he doesn't tire of looking at the busy scene. Till notices his curiosity and asks if there is a specific place he'd like to visit. Van responds right away, saying that he would like to see the market. At this age, Van is already known as a prodigy. He can defeat children twice his age in sword practice, and he learns things quickly, almost like an adult. Till once praises him, saying that if he keeps progressing at this rate, he might one day catch up to his brothers and even become the head of the family. While Van appreciates the praise, he doesn't feel entirely comfortable with the idea. He knows his relationship with his brothers isn't good, and he worries that being too successful might make things even more difficult between them. Van knows that if he even thinks about becoming the head of the family, his brothers wouldn't hesitate to kill him. He understands that standing out too much would only bring trouble, and he wouldn't be able to enjoy his life in peace. That's why he decides to stop acting like a prodigy and start living as an ordinary child. He wants to blend in, have fun, and experience life without drawing too much attention to himself. As he looks around, admiring the buildings and the busy streets, Van notices something that catches his eye. A child is being dragged by his father, who has the boy tied up with a rope. The father shouts that the debt is in his son's name, and he plans to sell him as a slave to pay it off. Van is shocked by this. Till explains to him that according to the law, there are 2 types of slaves, those who are enslaved because of debts and those who are enslaved for committing crimes. Till goes on to explain that long ago, in poor families, children who were abandoned or neglected were sometimes sold as slaves to be used for living expenses. Van feels a deep sense of sadness and confusion. He realizes that the people around him don't seem bothered by this, which means that they have become used to such things. The harshness of the system hits him hard, and he starts to understand just how different this world is from the one he once knew. At that moment, a female worker named Rosalie, who works for a company called Mirror Company, approaches Van. She notices that Van is a noble and asks him what he's looking to buy, offering to prepare it for him. Van, however, isn't interested in buying anything for himself. Instead, he asks Rosalie about the price of the slave child. Rosalie, curious, asks the boy's father for the child's age. The man reluctantly tells her that the boy is 8 years old. After considering it, Rosalie tells the father that the boy is only worth 3 big silver coins. The father becomes furious at this low price and starts beating the child, calling him useless for not being worth more money. Rosalie, upset by the father's actions, tries to intervene. She tells him to at least treat the child gently. But the father snaps at her, shouting that she shouldn't interfere with his business. He is angry enough to turn away from her offer, saying he's not planning to sell the boy to her anyway. He plans to look for another buyer. Van watches the scene unfold and, feeling pity for the child, steps in. He offers to buy the boy for 5 big silver coins, worried that the father might harm the child out of anger. The man, seeing the opportunity to get more money, agrees and asks for the payment. Till, Van's maid, steps forward and explains that they only have gold coins. Rosalie offers to help them by exchanging the gold coins for silver, eager to assist Van in completing his purchase. After the transaction is complete, and the boy's father leaves with the silver coins, Van approaches the child, who stands quietly, still processing what has just happened. Van introduces himself properly, offering a hand in kindness, and soon learns the boy's name. Kamshin Van, feeling a mix of sympathy and responsibility, tells Kamshin that he is now free and he can go anywhere he wants. However, Kamshin says nothing, his face blank as if he doesn't know how to respond to this sudden freedom. Van, not wanting to leave the boy abandoned in the streets, then offers him a place at his home, suggesting that he can work there if Kamshin wants. However, the guards following him explain that the Duke will likely not approve of Van bringing an unknown child into the residence unless he officially makes him a slave, as nobles are expected to follow strict rules about bringing outsiders into their homes. Kamshin, without hesitation, agrees to become a slave if that is what it takes to stay with Van. Rosalie, who has been quietly observing, then explains the process to Van. She says that for Kamshin to legally work as Van's servant, they need to sign a slave contract. Rosalie helps them with the procedure, guiding Van's hand to Kamshin's. The contract is marked on Kamshin's palm with a distinctive slave mark, confirming his status. Rosalie is kind enough to waive the usual fee for the contract, stating that she is doing it for free since it is Van's first time and she wants to help him out. Van then remembers that Kamshin will need clothes and asks Rosalie where they can find some. Without hesitation, she offers to help with that too, promising to guide them to a suitable place to buy clothes for the newly contracted slave. Kamshin has now settled into life at the Duke's mansion, where he serves Van as his personal attendant. One day, Kamshin enters Van's room to inform him that Dee is looking for him, eager to begin their usual sword practice. Van, however, is uninterested and does not want to train. He gives Kamshin a snack, hoping that the boy will tell Dee he hasn't seen him, thus avoiding the practice session. As Kamshin eats the snack, Van notices that he is not wearing the gloves he had bought for him. The gloves were meant to cover the slave mark on Kamshin's hand, which Van had hoped to keep hidden. He doesn't want Kamshin to face any humiliation from others noticing it. However, Kamshin explains that the slave mark is a sign of his bond to Van, and he feels it should be visible as a symbol of their connection, not something to hide. Just as Van is processing Kamshin's words, Dee's voice calls out for him, demanding his presence. Kamshin, quick to act, hides Van away in a closet to avoid being caught. He then goes to meet Dee, telling him that Van is not in the room. Dee, not convinced, insists that witnesses had seen Van there earlier, accusing Kamshin of lying. Despite the pressure, Kamshin stands firm, continuing to insist that Van is not there. Frustrated, Dee decides to take action. Since Van is missing, he orders Kamshin to take Van's place in the sword practice session. Kamshin, though inexperienced in swordsmanship, does not resist but is totally stunned by what Dee said. Van, hidden away in the closet, hears the exchange and realizes that Kamshin has taken his place. Van had made sure to keep a low profile over the past few years, working hard to avoid drawing too much attention to his prodigious abilities. He knew that if he stood out too much, his brothers, eager to protect their positions in the family, would see him as a threat, so he deliberately avoided showing off his talents in swordsmanship or academics. Even though he excelled in both, it was a fine balance. He needed to be good enough to avoid suspicion, but not so good that he became a target. Now at 8 years old, Van is about to undergo the highly anticipated magic appraisal ceremony. The entire household is buzzing with excitement, eager to see what type of magic he possesses. Everyone knows that Van is exceptional, and they expect him to have a strong affinity with one of the 4 elemental magics: water, fire, earth, or air. These are the most respected types of magic, especially in noble families like the Fergio family, where strength in fire magic is particularly valued. Van is known as a prodigy, and people have high expectations for the results of the ceremony. At the ceremony, Van steps up to be appraised. As the process unfolds, it is soon discovered that none of the 4 elemental magics match him. There is no affinity for water, fire, earth, or air, none of the usual elements that noble families, especially his own, would expect. Instead, Van's magic turns out to be creation magic, a type that is rarely seen and even more rarely valued. Creation magic is known to be one of the most unfortunate types of magic, as it is incredibly draining on a person's magical reserves. Those with creation magic can only create simple objects, such as weapons or decorations, and these creations are nothing special. In fact, people without magic talents, like blacksmiths or inventors, can make those same items without magic at all. As he listens to the murmurs and reactions around him, Van can't help but reflect on the situation. He had worked so hard to keep a low profile, hoping to avoid drawing attention, but now he finds himself in a position where his magic is considered useless by everyone around him. He had always known that in this world, magic was everything, and to be seen as ordinary or weak was to be disregarded. The Furcia family, with its focus on military strength and fire magic, had no use for someone like him. The eldest son, Mercia, inherited his maternal grandmother's wind magic compatibility. He works harder than anyone else in the family and currently holds the position of the family head representative. Despite his dedication, Mercia faces disdain from his younger brothers, the second and third sons, who possess fire magic, an element more highly valued within the family. Meanwhile, the Duke, unable to accept the fact that he and his wife, both strong fire magic users, gave birth to a child with creation magic, becomes furious. He draws his sword, intending to kill Van to hide the shame of having a failure as a son. The idea of anyone discovering Van's lack of elemental magic compatibility fills him with rage, and he sees Van as a disgrace to the family. Van, sensing the danger, realizes that the situation is turning critical, but just as the Duke is about to strike, Mercia steps forward, positioning himself between Van and their father. He faces the Duke with determination and speaks up, suggesting a solution to the crisis. Mercia points out that there is a remote area within the Duke's territory, an undeveloped village located in a far-off part of the family land. He proposes that Van be put in charge of this village, taking on the responsibility of developing the area. Mercia believes this will allow Van to have a place within the family without directly threatening their status, and it provides a way for Van to stay out of the family's more important affairs. The suggestion is a calculated move. By offering Van the position in a distant village, Mercia hopes to appease their father, who is embarrassed by the lack of strong magic in Van's bloodline. The Duke then asks why Mercia is suggesting this, to which Mercia calmly explains that the village in question originally had over 1,000 residents. However, the area is lacking in valuable local products, though its magical resources are far more powerful. To the north, the Wolfsburg Mountains offer these magical resources, though they are not easily accessible. Nearby, there is Count Ferdinand's land, a region embroiled in conflict with the kingdom of Yerenetta on the opposite side. This means the village is quite far from other major cities, but it is strategically close to Count Ferdinand's stronghold. Mercia points out that one of the advantages of the village is that it is rarely used by Count Ferdinand's knights as a campsite for training expeditions, making it a low-priority location that could be managed without much interference. The Duke pauses, recalling that this village is part of the territory he acquired when he was promoted to Duke. He also remembers that it is the place where Count Ferdinand sends knights to be judged, a reminder of the political tension between their territories. With this in mind, the Duke realizes that leaving the village in Van's hands wouldn't be a problem. It would, in fact, be better for a member of the Duke's family to oversee the village, even if it is only in name. In the end, the Duke decides to assign Van as the feudal lord of the village, marking the beginning of his new role. After making this decision, the Duke leaves with his other 2 sons, leaving Van to take on this new responsibility. Mercia then apologizes to Van for suggesting such a thing. He can't stand to see his little brother struggle because of his magic. Van, however, reassures him, expressing his gratitude for Mercia's help. Without his intervention, Van believes he might have been arrested or killed instead. He promises that he won't waste the opportunity that Mercia has given him. Mercia is amazed by Van's words. He can see that Van is truly a genius, but he also feels a sense of regret. He knows that sending Van to a remote village might be a painful experience for him, and there's not much he can do to make it easier. All he can do now is support Van as best as he can. Later, Till is seen trying to comfort Van. She tells him that even without magic, he would still be a wise and honorable noble. However, she worries about him going to the remote village. Van reassures her, telling her not to worry. In fact, he is even looking forward to the new challenge. He feels that his wish has come true. He will be free to live on his own terms. As the feudal lord of the village, Van knows he won't have to do much, leaving him plenty of time to enjoy his life. He plans to make the village his favorite place to live, where he can live comfortably and happily. Even though they are from the Duke's family, the Furcio family doesn't seem much different from commoners. Nobles often spout all kinds of rhetoric to make themselves feel superior, but in the end, their first priority is to protect themselves, not the kingdom. They would even neglect the security of their people to maintain their own status. Nobles tend to look down on civilians, especially adventurers who are seen as lower in rank. Orto, who happens to be an adventurer, is seen talking to a female adventurer. He is preparing to guard a noble child, Van. Orto expresses his disdain for the royal family, noting how adventurers like him are often unable to deal with royalty. He finds the nobility arrogant and entitled. However, when the request to guard Van comes from the Furcio family, Orto reluctantly agrees. He has no choice but to accept the request because of the family's status. When Van meets Orto, he surprises the adventurer by already knowing his name before Orto can introduce himself. Van casually introduces himself back, which shocks Orto. He wasn't expecting Van, a noble child, to be so casual. Orto and the other two adventurers who will also guard Van are all taken aback by how he interacts with them. Van seems like just an ordinary boy to them, despite his noble background. After the two other adventurers successfully introduce themselves, Van instructs them to load their luggage into the 3 horse-drawn carriages. He explains that since the escort cannot borrow carriages from the Knight Army, his brother Mersha has arranged for 10 adventurers to help with transportation. Van expresses his gratitude for the support. Originally, only a single carriage was planned for Van's journey, but that plan changes when Till decides she will accompany him. Van is aware that only a few people know about the magic he possesses, which is different from the standard 4 basic elements. This is something he keeps low-key, preferring to stay under the radar. In addition to Till, Dee also insists on accompanying Van. He claims that he wants to protect Van from any potential danger. However, Van is unsure whether he is allowed to request an escort from the Knight Army. Dee, desperate to follow him, does not have a clear answer but tells the other knights to prepare for the journey. Hoping that everything will work out, Van is also informed that his father will soon retire, as all his children are now grown. Esparta, a trusted servant, believes there should be no problem with him retiring as well. At 55 years old, Esparta feels he deserves to relax in the countryside. However, Van cannot let Esparta go so easily. He understands the significance of Esparta's years of service to his family and knows it would be difficult to replace someone so trusted. Esparta assures Van that, even though he is retiring, he will still oversee Van's studies. Van is surprised by the preparations, not expecting to need so much for what is essentially a trip to a remote village. However, he is pleased by the fact that so many people are accompanying him, which makes him feel supported on his journey. As Van smiles, Till notices his expression and asks why he seems so happy. He explains that it is because he has so many people with him. Till, in turn, is happy that she is the one chosen to accompany Van, especially since many other maids wanted to come along. She feels fortunate, having gained the favor of Mersha, which makes her feel proud. Till understands that Van is an accommodating person, and many of the maids want to go with him. It almost feels like a competition to her, but she knows that all the maids appreciate Van's kindness. Kanshin, too, is determined to accompany Van, having decided to devote his life to him. Kanshin admires Van and is eager to be by his side, showing his dedication. With everything packed and ready, they set off on their journey. The carriage, however, does not bear the royal family crest. This is intentional, as Van's father wants to keep his departure low-key and avoid drawing attention. Van understands the need to erase his existence from the public eye, especially since his time in the town has been so lonely in recent years. As they continue their journey, Van is caught off guard when Halo, the daughter of a guard, spots him inside the carriage. She had heard that he was leaving, so she made sure to inform the villagers. Van feels embarrassed as he notices the villagers gathering, seemingly in response to Halo's notice. He had hoped for a quiet departure, but now the villagers are waving at him, some even questioning him about his departure. Their emotional reactions surprise Van, making him feel a bit pathetic as he didn't realize they felt so strongly about him leaving. Things take another turn when knights appear on horseback to announce his departure, which shocks Van. He had believed that his father would keep this matter low profile, but he later learns that it was Dee who instructed the knights to make the announcement. Meanwhile, Dee, who had fallen asleep in the carriage, doesn't seem aware of the situation. Van hopes Dee will wake up soon and orders the knights to lower their flags, but it is clear the villagers are already too excited, some still waving at him with emotional farewells. The journey continues, and they soon face the need to pass through two cities. Before reaching them, they set up camp for the first time. Van, who had only experienced life in a car during his previous life, is now experiencing camping in this dangerous world, which is full of monsters. To ensure his safety, he requests the help of two groups of adventurers. The leader of one group is Orto, a seasoned adventurer with more than 20 years of experience. He's known for his ability to interact with clients, and despite Van being just 8 years old, Orto speaks to him with a no-nonsense, decisive tone. While Orto keeps watch, Van, showing his kindness, offers him a chance to rest, but Orto insists that he is fine and can handle the responsibility. Till, who knows Van well, is not surprised by his generosity. As the journey continues, Van's group camps several times as they make their way through different cities. They visit 4 cities in total, some large and some small, and they rest for an entire day in each, though their progress is slow due to the heavy luggage. 2 weeks later, after walking 50 to 100 kilometers each day, Van and his group have covered a distance of about 500 to 1,000 kilometers. The vastness of the kingdom becomes apparent to him. In comparison to Japan, it feels like traveling through 3 or even 4 prefectures. Van wonders about the actual distance they've traveled and how much further they have to go. Eventually, Till informs Van that they are nearing the village. Van starts to worry about the first impression he'll make. He likens it to the scenario where a new boss is transferred into a workplace, and everyone wonders how the new leader will fit in. As they approach the entrance of the village, Orto, who is scouting ahead, immediately notices something troubling. He realizes the village seems to be under attack, and it's not safe for them to continue forward.
Here I am, know it's been a while. I was in denial about my love. Here I stand, I know I walked away.